Hi, I'm Norm Abram. Welcome to the New Yankee Workshop. I'm told that one of the fastest growing sports is croquet. Now, if you're going to play a game of grace and elegance, you have to have the right equipment. So today we're going to build our own mallets and a box to store them in. That's next, right here on the New Yankee Workshop. Today we're in Newport, Rhode Island, at the estate known as Chateau-sur-Mer. It's cared for by the Preservation Society of Newport County, and we're here to learn about the game of croquet. They have a beautiful croquet lawn back here. Now, the equipment that's used are these mallets, hardwood mallets, often bound with a brass ring, and the shaft is made of either hickory or ash. Now, the balls are no longer made out of wood. They're made out of a composite material so that they stay round, and the metal wickets are only 1/16 of an inch wider than the ball itself. Now, the gentleman in the shorts, he's the president of the Newport Croquet Association. Earlier we had a game. It was pathetic.
And then, being ball in hand and blue, I can now peg him out and then peg out myself. And that's it. That was a good game.
That was a good game. You know,
much.
after a couple hours, I'm still not sure I understand all the rules, and my shot certainly needs a lot of work.
It's complicated, but it's great fun.
Well, you've taught me a lot.
The more you get to know it, the more you like it.
Well, as you can see, my game has improved a bit since our visit to Newport, but I still have a long way to go. I feel more comfortable in my plaid shirt and jeans rather than those whites. Now, the mallet that I'm using today is one that you can buy. This one costs about $50, but there's no limit. These can cost several $100s. So I got to thinking, why not make our own? I'm going to start by gluing up some material for the mallet head. I decided that rather than use a solid piece of wood which could check and split, that I would laminate some pieces together. Now, if you look at the pieces, you can see the joint isn't quite tight, and I want a real tight joint for a good glue bond. So I'm going to run these pieces through my joiner to start. But before we use any power tools, let's talk about shop safety. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use your power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now, you've seen me do this before. I'm just spreading a thin layer of this polyurethane glue. It's very weather resistant and it works great. Put the glue on one side, wet the other side because it actually likes to cure in the presence of moisture. Now, it's important to wear gloves because if you get this stuff on your hands, it takes about a week for it to wear off. Put it together and we'll clamp it up. Okay, that's not going anywhere. This will take about 8 to 12 hours to cure, but I got one that's all ready to go. Now look at that. You can see how this glue foams out as it cures. The first step is to remove it, just taking a scraper. And once that's done, we'll run it through the joiner. Now with two faces, smooth and square, I can run those against the rip fence to get the square blank that I'm going to turn. Okay, there's blanks for two mallets. Now that's the first pass for a kerf to install the inlay for the sight line. Now if I turn it around and run it through, I know that the slot is perfectly centered. Here's the strip of hickory that I'm going to use for that sight line. I'm using some exterior carpenter's glue. Just tap it into the kerf, put a spring clamp on it, and we'll let that dry. Let's take a look at the shaft. It's rectangular in shape, and it has the corners knocked off for comfort. I start out by taking some of my hickory and milling up the blanks and cutting them to length. Now I want to run them through the joiner to chamfer the edge. At my joiner, I've tipped the fence to 45 degrees. Now it's a real tight space down there, so I want to have a good push stick to run the pieces through. Okay, I've mounted one of the blanks in my lathe and tested it to make sure it's balanced. I've taken the prototype shaft and set it up here so you can see what we're trying to do. The top 18 inches of the shaft remains rectangular. Then I'm going to cut in, make it round with a slight taper down to this knob, and then I'm going to turn the end exactly 7/8 of an inch in diameter to fit the mallet head. And that's where these calipers come in handy. That has to be very precise. I'm going to start the turning by using my gouge. Now that I have the piece roughed out and round, I want to put a mark for the length of the tenon that's going to go into the mallet head. And I'll just mark it, turn the lathe back on, mark it all the way around. Now I can speed the lathe up a bit and start to refine the shaft. All right, that's pretty good. Now I can start working on that tenon. I'm going to use a parting tool and make a cut right at my line until I get down to the exact 7/8 inch diameter. Once I've accomplished that, I'll use that as a reference to make the rest of the tenon. Using this scraper, I've just smoothed the tenon, and as good as the calipers are, I like to make sure it's going to fit the actual hole and bit that I'm using to drill the holes. So what I do is I take a scrap piece of wood, drill a hole, and use that as the final test. This has to be a snug fit. Now that's pretty good. A little bit too tight. Maybe I'll take a little bit off. Okay, that should do it. Now I can move the tool rest out of the way and sand the shaft smooth. To get rid of the marks left by the drive center at the lathe, I'm going to remove about 1/4 of an inch. Now I'm going to turn the miter box to 45 degrees and just chamfer the corners. Now we want to get to work on the mallet head. First thing I want to do is plane the sight line down so it's even. Now to save me some time at the lathe, I'm knocking off the corners of this blank, simply with the saw blade tipped to 45 degrees. It's going to be a lot easier to drill the hole for the shaft in the mallet head before it's round. So I'm using a 7/8 inch Forstner bit, and I'll drill all the way through. Let's look at the prototype. You can see that there's a shoulder line at each end for that brass ring. I'll lay out for that next. The next step is to take this skew chisel and make a V-cut right along this layout line. That'll give me the chamfer at the head of the mallet, and it'll show me where I want to cut it off. Now, one more step, little trick I learned from an Irishman down in Nantucket. You take the sawdust, just hold it up against the piece, and it burnishes it, makes it nice and smooth and shiny. Works great. Now here I'm just cutting off the excess so I won't have the centering holes showing in the finished head. A little sanding at my stationary belt sander, then we'll be ready for the brass rings. We picked up the brass pipe for the rings from our local brass supplier. They're rare these days, but we did find one. It's 2.5-inch outside diameter, and it's soft enough that I can cut it right here on the bandsaw. Now we'll just clean up the rough edges at the belt sander. Now I'm ready to attach the brass rings to the mallet head. First I'm going to drill a hole through the brass. I'm going to switch to this countersink to make a recess for the screw head. Okay, now a smaller drill bit. There's a pilot hole for the screw in this very hard wood. And finally, a brass screw. We'll put 2 of these in each ring. All right, let's start to put the mallet together. First thing is I'm going to slide the shaft all the way in. And I want to make sure that the head is square to the handle. So I lay it on a flat surface and just turn it until both are parallel with the table. And then I just take a pencil and put a mark here to key it, so when I actually glue it, I don't have to fool around lining it up. Now I'm just going to trace the outline of this excess and trim it at the miter saw. And there's a little wedge out of the babinga. Now a little of our water-resistant carpenter's glue. Just put a thin coat on the shaft and a little bit inside the hole of the mallet. Okay, now we'll slip the 2 pieces together. There. A little more glue on the wedge and some in the slot of the shaft, and we'll just drive that in. Okay, and I'll cut that off and then sand the shafts to the shape of the mallet head. Okay, this mallet's ready for the finishing room. Well, I can't think of a better finish to protect our mallets and show off this beautiful babinga in our hickory than spar varnish. If it works for boats, it's going to work for the mallets. I'll put on a couple coats with a light sanding in between. We didn't see one of these in Newport, but it turns out that benches to store all the croquet equipment were very popular at one time. It was a place for the equipment, and it was a place for the players to sit down when they weren't participating. So we came up with a design of our own. It consists of a back leg backrest post, a front post, and a nice curved armrest with a panel down below that sits between a couple rails. Now I want to get started today working on the back leg. Once again, we're going to turn to our river-recovered cypress because it's a good rot-resistant wood for outdoors. I've laminated together a blank of 8/4 stock and 3/4 stock for those legs, and I've done the layout. I started with the lower part of the leg along the edge of the blank, turned 10 degrees, which will make a comfortable backrest, and then laid out some parallel lines. I want to make this cut first. I could do it at the bandsaw, or I could push it through the table saw freehand. But there's a better way to get a nice, accurate cut. Just take a piece of hardboard, tack it to the blank parallel to the layout line, and then I have something that I can run against the fence as a guide. So I'll sight by eye to the saw blade, and I want to leave a little more than the line on. I deliberately left it on so I could smooth it by running it through the joint. For the back of the leg, I'll have to remove some of the material on the bandsaw, and that's between the 2 marks that I just made. For the straight cut, I can use the table saw, But what I need to know is exactly where the leading edge of the blade will be so I don't overcut. So I just take a piece of square wood, put it up against the fence, and draw a line on my table. Now when I run the piece in, as long as I stop on that line, I won't overcut. Now to the bandsaw. Now back to the bandsaw to sweeten the top. For the last few minutes I've been laying out for all the mortises that are going to be needed in this leg. And I have to keep in mind that I have to make a mirror image because we have opposing ends. The first mortises I'm going to drill out are this one and this one, which are for the backrest, and a third one, which will be for this armrest. I'm going to use my dedicated mortiser with the largest chisel I have, which is 1/2 inch, to make these mortises. While the 1/2 inch chisel is in the mortiser, I want to make this mortise in the armrest piece, which is all laid out on this blank. As you can see, I've now switched over to my 3/8 inch chisel, and that allows me to make all the mortises for the rails which will form the box. The next step is to make a groove between the two mortises for the backrest, and that's going to receive some 1/2 inch plywood as a panel. To do that, I've set up my router table with a 1/2 inch straight cutting bit, set the fence so that it's going to be right in the middle of the mortise. I've transferred a couple marks around to the center of the mortise. I'll drop it in over the bit, push it through until I reach the other mortise. That's all there is to it. There's another groove that I need in these pieces between the mortise for the box rails. Here's a sample of a lower rail with the tenon that fits into the mortises I made earlier. It has a groove down the center which matches the groove that I need in the leg. Here's a piece of 1/2 inch plywood that I've rabbited the edges on, and that will fit into those grooves, forming the panels for the box. The groove that I need between those mortises is next. Here I'm running some rail stock, and the idea is to get a 1/4 inch groove right down the center. So with the 1/4 inch dado head set up, one pass, turn it around, run it through, and I know it's centered. This 1/2 inch groove is in a rail for the backrest, and it will receive the 1/2 inch plywood. With my dado just slipped under my sacrificial fence, I can rabbit the plywood so it'll fit in the grooves. Here I'm beginning to form the tenons on the rails for the box. These are called the shoulder cuts. I've made an adjustment to the height of the saw blade, raising it to 3/8 of an inch to make a shoulder cut on each edge. A couple quick passes at the bandsaw complete the top and bottom edge of each tenon. Here I'm using my tenoning jig to make the cheek cuts to complete the tenon. Here I've turned my miter box to 10 degrees, and I'm going to make a cut on the end of the blank for the armrest. That takes care of the first shoulder cut on the end of the armrest. Now I'm going to turn my miter gauge 10 degrees on the other side of 0 and make the second shoulder cut. At the bandsaw, I can freehand the top and bottom shoulder cuts for the tenon. Here I'm bandsawing the armrest. After I complete this, more drum sanding. To ease the edges of the armrest, I'm just using a 1/2 inch round over bit. We've applied some primer in all the hidden areas, the grooves, and the edges of the plywood panels. Then it's a matter of putting glue in all the mortises and on the tenons, putting it together, and clamping it up. Now, this is the tricky part. Okay, now a couple cleats along the bottom rail, glue and brads, and they will support the boards for the bottom of the storage box. The bottom of the box is just some 1x4 pressure-treated lumber, loosely fitted and secured with some brads. This piece of cypress has had 3 edges rounded over, and it's going to become the beginning of our seat. Now I need to notch out the corners so that it'll fit around the legs. This little cleat will provide support for the plywood lid. The lid is hinged with 2 hinges secured to the underside of the plywood lid and to this back rail. A little bit of glue on the edge of this piece of nosing that I just made, I can cover up the plywood edge. I'll just secure it with some 1.5-inch brads. Okay, a little bit of final sanding, and this piece will be ready for the paint shop. Okay, well that takes care of the primer coat. Now the finished coat is going to be a beautiful bottle green. Ah, so good, they'll probably make it illegal. Mr. Abram will be using the Babinga mallet with the hickory shaft for a perfect shot. Hey, look at this. Told you we were going to paint it a nice bottle green. And look at the inside. Plenty of room to store all the equipment. Well, now that I have all this stuff, maybe I should invite the Newport crowd up here for a home game. Of course, I'd have to wear my whites again.